Welcome to the Nomiki Show. I am Nomiki Konst. You are watching our holiday series, the special holiday series where we have done a ton of pre-taped, extensive interviews with phenomenal authors and activists, and we're having deeper dive conversations with them about their work. I am thrilled to have Jared Yates Sexton on. He is the host of the Muckrack podcast, and he is the author of American Rule: How a Nation Conquered the World but failed its own people. There's a lot there. Jared, thanks for joining us today.
Hey, thank you.
So, this is a very provocative title. And I think anybody who watches our show is probably familiar with the basis of American imperialism and how, we as a society and our government has not necessarily protected our own people in pursuit of imperialist conquests and capitalism, essentially. So what inspired you to write this book right now?
Well, it's one of those things. I sort of cut my teeth on politics back in 2015, 2016. I was I was going into Trump rallies back when they would just broadcast them live for, 3-4 hours at a clip. And, I was going into these rallies and I was starting to realize, talking to the people, that there was a real problem brewing in this country. There was something ugly underneath the veneer. And after that, and particularly after he won in 2016, all of a sudden the story of America that I was sort of raised up on, that I think a lot of people were raised up on, suddenly didn't make a lot of sense anymore. And I think we all heard a lot of people that are like, if the founding fathers knew about Donald Trump, they'd be rolling over in their graves. And so I decided, I was like, I need to go back to the very beginning of America and figure out how in the world we could ever arrive at this point. And so from the very beginning, what I found out was, the founders are not rolling in their graves. In fact, they'd be like, oh, there's a wealthy white man in charge. I'm sure everything is great. And basically what I discovered is, from the very beginning, this idea of American exceptionalism and this idea that America is dedicated to freedom, liberty, and equality was a total con job from the very beginning. It was a salesmanship. It was something to be sold to the people that hid control by the powerful and the wealthy and the white. And I traced that throughout American history, and I just found how we've arrived at this point, and why our politics has become not just poisonous and fascistic, but that it's actually been completely removed from reality altogether.
I mean, it's without jumping around in history too much, but the first figure that stands out to me is Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt being like the Harvard, Yale graduate, the child of wealthy, but wanted to pretend. He reminds me of these libertarian bros now who are like, manifest destiny, let's go conquer Puerto Rico and build offices there and whatever. That's how I Manifest Destiny to me was just a bunch of bros who wanted to shoot Indians and claim their land. Is that a fair analysis?
I mean, that's not a bad summary of it. First and foremost, I think it's really interesting you brought up Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt was like an ill-stricken young man who was so insecure in his manhood that he had to recreate himself as a rough-riding macho hero, right? Which, by the way, to draw parallels to Donald Trump, who pretends he's all strong and tough, and meanwhile is just the weakest, most sensitive person. There are masculinity issues all throughout this, as well as how we project ourselves and how we behave in the world versus who we actually are and who we're afraid that we are. The manifest destiny thing is a really awful moment in American history. And I know for me, being taught about it, I was taught, we got these people going west and they're just conquering the land, and what heroes they are, what gumption they have. And what you actually find when you look at manifest destiny is it is a white supremacist invention. It's this idea. And by the way, back when this all took place in the 19th century, we actually have this thing called romanticism, right? The romantic movement of the time, which weirdly enough inspired America and Germany. Not that those two things would, end up coming together and intertwined. But the whole idea was that these ethnic groups were stronger than other ethnic groups, and we needed to go out and conquer the world in the name of our ethnic group. So Manifest Destiny gets treated like Americans marching west, but it's actually white people marching west.
Right.
It's actually white people wanting to go from coast to coast and control everything. And you actually look back at the documents and the speeches at the time, and they're talking about giant, massive colossuses of Christopher Columbus pointing west, which is something that they thought about doing. And you actually start thinking about like what actually was taking place at the time. It's not just a genocide, but it's the type of ethnic cleansing that we would later on come to say that America was completely against.
And they and when the ethnic cleansing became too for what, I don't know if it was never politically, it was just, it was inconvenient, I guess. They just started pushing native tribes obviously into different regions, and and not to mention all the different illnesses that came across and killed native populations and indigenous populations across the country. But it was all for the pursuit of land. So like these white men could just stake their plot. It's interesting you say that the speeches there's, I don't know how many folks have like read about the colonization of, like, say, Puerto Rico, which I mentioned before. There are doctors who had flat out who went there to test on Puerto Rican population and were flat out racist. I mean, like, it was horrifying how racist. This is like in the 60s. So this, I guess, let's just start with the fact that, okay, this is the origin of America, but it's like we as a society, as a quote unquote democratic society, haven't started to have these conversations until maybe it was the 60s, like in open air, when there were when the Civil Rights Act was being passed. And even then, of course, there's flat out racists that obviously still exist. So where was the turning point when suddenly this stuff started to air out?
Well, I mean, there have been these moments, and this is one of the weirder things I found reading American history, because conventional history sort of tells us that, Americans were good natured, and that, yeah, we had some slavery for a while, and yeah, we carried out a genocide, and well, the Civil War took care of all this stuff. Abraham Lincoln, who, by the way, we have these moments in history where it's like Abraham Lincoln like was trying to convince freed slaves to leave America so that America could have a white ethno state, which, by the way, I didn't get taught that in class. That's not
Right.
something that came up. But you find these moments in American history where progress or progressives will try and push back and find some sort of equality, some sort of movement towards this thing. And weirdly enough, every time that happens, the powerful and the wealthy, they follow the same roadmap. First things first is they start spinning these conspiracy theories. And it's the same conspiracy theory every time. Tell me if this sounds familiar. There are puppet masters outside of America. And by the way, that's either Jews, communist, or Jewish communist, who are manipulating people of color into being violent and rising up, and also liberal traitors within America who are trying to destroy the country. So what you actually see, and by the way, this goes back into pre-Civil War times. I mean, the Confederacy was actually based on that very conspiracy theory. And then, of course, you move into the 20th century, and all of a sudden it becomes Russia and communist. And then you start moving into the 60s, which, weirdly enough, all of the anti-war people, all of the civil rights people, well, they are being manipulated by outside manipulators and internal traitors. So what you actually see is that we've had many moments where we start actually looking at who we are and what we've done. And every time the wealthy and powerful then deploy these exact same conspiracy theories. And what ends up happening is, because of that conspiracy theory, they have a legitimate reason, quote unquote, to carry out violence, because these people are terrorists, they're traitors. Like, we have to put them down as if, they're members of a terrorist organization. So what I've actually found is, right now is another one of those moments in the constant cycle of America. We're actually talking about history. There's a reason why Donald Trump was screaming for months at a time about patriotic education, right? This idea that we have to teach the greatness of America. I mean, which is all propaganda, and it's the type of
Right.
stuff that we've
How
seen for
does it get
decades.
more great than the propaganda that we grew up with?
Exactly. And what we actually have right now, and this is one of the things that I think, I don't think that people actually understand this in this country, because when we look at history, we kind of tend to always think of our current moment as being static. Like, life will always be like this forever and nothing will ever change and there will never be a crisis. We're at a moment where all of a sudden this old idea of the past is, I mean, well, it's crumbling because it's false. This idea that America hasn't been racist and aristocratic from the very beginning, it's false. It's a lie. And the lie starts to get really, really threadbare. And you sort of have a choice to make. You either find something new and true and honest and human, or those people will go ahead and inflict violence until you forget that the lie is a lie. We're at a moment. We're on a precipice of something different. And the question is whether or not that will actually come through and whether or not we'll actually move forward or not.
Um, I want to talk a little bit about the founders because you have analyzed Madison, who I always thought was one of the better ones. Uh, because listen, nobody's running away with the humanitarian rights award, but of the founders, he had a much more. He seemed to have a much more equitable representative. As much as possible with white men, landholders that were rich, interpretation of what an America should look like, comparatively to someone like Hamilton, or who
Mhm.
who has been reinvented for capitalist purposes. So, what's your take on Madison?
Well, so one of the things that ends up happening, and this is one of the big misunderstandings of the American Revolution. The American Revolution is sold to us as this just general uprising. Everybody in America got together and defeated the king in the name of democracy. But in fact, it's actually more of like a move from a kingship to an aristocracy. Right. It's like that you have like a lot of wealthy landowners and merchants in America who don't want to pay taxes and at the feet of a king anymore. They want to control their destinies and the destinies of their country. At the time, that probably seemed pretty revolutionary, right? I mean, the movement of the chain and where the hierarchy worked. Madison, when he was looking at creating this country, like this was a moment of enlightenment. It was learned people using their intelligence and reason, right? So he creates this government, which, by the way, he had no authority to do whatsoever. And, we always call it the Constitutional Convention now, but they actually did not have any authority whatsoever to write a constitution. They were in
Authority
Philadelphia.
from whom? From the king? From the people?
Legislature,
Okay.
so we have the Declaration of Independence in 1776.
Yes.
Instead of a constitution for a while, we actually have what's called the Articles of Confederation, which is sort
Right.
of a failure of a document that, it was falling apart. Well, in Philadelphia, when the Constitution gets written, they're actually supposed to be revising the Articles of Confederation. They're supposed to be making it better. Well, Madison gets there before everyone else because he's closer and they're all riding horses and, fighting dysentery. So Madison gets there before everybody and he's just hanging out and he just starts writing a constitution based
Mm.
on like Montesquieu and all of these philosophers, the way that they've created these things. Well, he creates what he thinks is a perfect government. And in Madison's mind, it is the best government possible. It's the closest thing to a democracy we can have. But the reason he designs it the way he does is because they don't trust normal people. They think normal people are ridiculous, that they'll be manipulated, that they should be kept away from power. And if you actually look through Madison's notes, it's extremely white supremacist and it's also incredibly aristocratic and classist, right? So he creates this government where the people will have some say, but they'll be neutralized because they're in the House of Representatives. They won't be able to touch the presidency. They won't be able to touch the Senate. They won't be able to touch the Supreme Court. They can have a lower House of Representatives. Well, at the time, this is a failure of political imagination, right? Because they truly believe that the white, wealthy men of the country will just always just kind of agree because they're reasonable, right? They won't form parties. There won't be factionalism. You won't have incompetent, wealthy white men, which turns out you have a lot of wealthy, incompetent white men. And so what actually ends up happening is there is a good intent behind Madisonian architecture, but it's a lack of imagination, as we've seen, because of the failure of misogyny and racism and classism, and all those things sort of come together to create a document that right now is just kind of hanging on by a thread.
And how much of that is not, I mean, you say white supremacy, how much of it was internalized, or actually like his feelings towards towards people of color and women, and how much of it was just that systematically and institutionally people of color and
Mhm,
women, people of color, of course, African Americans and natives, of course, had no rights, but how much of it was just that they weren't provided
mhm,
education, any pathways, so by default they didn't have the tools
mhm.
to govern.
Well, I first and foremost, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that there's not one mention in the constitutional debate about women. The
Right.
the, the word
Oh,
woman is
I
never
know
mentioned
that.
one. like at some point somebody like doesn't even bring it up and they all laugh about it. That doesn't even happen. In terms of African Americans and slaves at the time, they're treated very much like a bargaining chip. right? Because one of the things that we find, and this again is one of the things we don't get taught about history, because when we talk about the Civil War, because we want to, we want to have quote unquote unity and not really deal with white supremacy, we just kind of talk about how great the generals were and, how great they were on the battlefield. And we don't ever talk about why the Civil War happened or anything behind it. But what you actually find is in order, and I'm glad you brought up Hamilton, because Hamilton's like, we need to take over the world and have the best economy of anything and don't let anything stop
We're
us from
like
doing
12
that.
people
Right.
in
The
America at the
12
time.
people with power. And he's like, we need to take over everything. And they're like, well, you know what? Let's go ahead and give the South outsized power through their slave population, and we'll leave slavery alone. We won't worry about it. We don't need to fight about it. We'll avoid a civil war by having these agreements. And then, of course, we have a civil war because of those agreements. So it ends up becoming a thing where, they're not even talked about as people. It's property.
Um, Property, because this is a capitalist, let's just call it what it is. From
Yep.
the origins, this was about capitalism. In capitalism was their way of giving themselves power in comparison to when they left the king's rule in England, of course. Um, so how does this resonate through time when more rights are given to the citizens of this country? Um, you say that their tactics haven't changed in some ways, but their tactics have changed in that, granted, Congress is still majority wealthy white men. Hasn't Yes, there are more women than ever, and there are more working women finally, and people of color. But let's just be real: this country is still ruled. Joe Biden is an example, by white men. So is it conscious? Like, is this a conscious effort now? Is there an awareness that perpetuating the rule of a wealthy white man protects capitalism? Like, I know in our world, we distinguish these things all the time, but I don't sometimes know if a Pete Buttigieg understands his role in this game.
I think that's the really insidious thing about all this, right? Is you even have people on the left who believe themselves to be benevolent white people who are actually engaged in white supremacy and capitalistic exploitation. That's one of the really dangerous things about America. And what we actually find post Civil War, particularly, is you start to see government and politics become maybe more and more sort of equal with every sort of passing generation. But what you've actually seen happen, particularly past civil rights, like let's go into the 1970s and particularly the 1980s and where we are now, is you actually see you kind of see, because the government starts working for people of color and equality, particularly by passing civil liberties and anti-prejudice legislation. What you actually end up seeing is that the right and white supremacists start to actually erode the power of government, and they start dismantling government as any possible, public good. I mean, everything that the New Deal set up in the 1940s has more or less been erased outside of a couple of things which they're just ready to do tomorrow if they get the chance. So what you end up seeing is it gets to the point where it's like, oh, if government has to work towards equality, we will defang government and we will drain government of working for public good. We'll make sure that the people who are in there are bought and sold by special interest, and more or less starting in the 1990s particularly, everybody involved in government more or less is more interested in making sure that the economy works, i.e. make sure that people are being exploited and you're extracting as much as you possibly can from the labor force and also from the people and the resources, as opposed to public good, which, by the way, in the middle of a pandemic, when they're fighting over giving us all $600, it should tell you everything you need to know, which is this has become a front for white supremacist capitalistic interest versus being an engine of good for the people. And that's intentional.
Before we wrap up, we only have like 2 minutes left, but you mentioned FDR, and what's so interesting to me about FDR is, yes, he took on capital and he
Mhm.
came from wealthy and he put forward the New Deal, but he also was a big fan of colonization.
Yep.
There were some very racist people that he
Yep.
appointed, and he backed them up. He's an interesting figure in history for me because in so many ways he battled the white supremacist capitalism of this country. Of course, the New Deal was not necessarily, let's just say it's racist. What, where was his line? Like, how I find him such a strange figure in history,
He is, and
because of that.
I actually think we can learn a lot from the presidency of FDR. First and foremost, I think one of the bigger problems in this country is the idea of the Messiah or Satan, which is that every figure in the country is either perfect and unimpeachable, or they are the worst human being who has ever lived, and everything that they could do is possibly wrong. And I actually think that keeps the left particularly from questioning the people who represent them and who is president and who is going to Washington for them. But meanwhile, I think that you look at something like the New Deal, we have a complete misunderstanding of the New Deal. It didn't necessarily save the economy. What it did was it took young white men who might have gotten into fascism because there was a burgeoning fascistic movement in the country, and it put them to work so they wouldn't join a fascist movement. So it actually does a workaround on that thing. But at the same time, you're exactly right. FDR was not without prejudices, and he isn't a saint. Like, we need to understand that people can do good things while meanwhile having really problematic beliefs. And I think that we have to sort of we have to square that circle. We have to actually treat politics in this country like it's a real thing, and it's not a symbolic fight. And I think that that is unfortunately, we've gotten to the point of illusion in this country. I think that's a big problem.
Well, if it doesn't fit in hashtag, we're not able to solve it.
That's exactly right. It needs to get right at 280 characters or you're done.
Oh no, I sound like Obama now. Oh man. Well, it's like, if it's not a hashtag, then what's the policy? That's the other question.
Right.
Jared Yates Sexton, such a fascinating conversation. Would love to have you back on. I have like 9,000 more questions, and hope to have you back on soon. But go check out Jared's book. It is out right now. Go to your independent publisher online. Don't go to Amazon, basically. American Rule: How a Nation Conquered the World, but Failed Its Own People. Good holiday bye. Good holiday bye. Thanks so much, Jared.
Hey, thank you. Have a good one.
Thanks for watching and listening to The Nomiki Show. But remember to click like and subscribe on YouTube, and please share on social media. If you're not already a patron, please join us for as low as $5 a month on patreon.com/The Nomiki Show for early and special content. That investment makes a huge difference. We are not corporate media raking in the dough. It's really you guys that are keeping us going. So please consider being a patron. And to our current patrons, thank you so much. We are incredibly grateful to you. We also now have swag. So check us out on thenomikishow.com to get your mugs, your totes, and your stickers.